In today's note, what we're going to look at are parallel and perpendicular lines. Now, parallel lines are lines that will never touch or intersect, so they'll run side by side if you want to think of something like train tracks, right? Train tracks never cross each other. If you think of one track, the two side by side, they never cross each other. Perpendicular lines are lines that meet at 90 degrees or a right angle. So these are lines that do cross, and what's unique about this is that they cross at a perfect 90-degree or right angle. So what we're going to do is investigate or look at how can we determine parallel and perpendicular lines, or what's unique about these sets of lines. So in investigation 1, we want to graph each pair of the lines below. And what we're going to do is look at these lines and see what do we notice about them. How do they relate to each other? And when we do that, we should get something like this. Now, we should be able to graph based on an equation and by finding the slope and the y-intercept. So some things to point out. In my first one, if I see just x, that means my slope is 1. In graph 2, when I have a whole number, that means it's always over 1, so that's how you can figure out your rise over run. And then for graph 3, if I don't see anything added, that means it's a plus 0. It's the only number that I can add where it means nothing, or I'm adding nothing, or I don't need to show it. So we've graphed the pairs below, and what do we notice when we're looking at them? Well, what we should notice is that these are parallel lines. So what we notice about these graphs, again, they're parallel lines. They're never going to touch. They're not going to intersect. So what do we notice? We notice that they are parallel. So that's what we notice by looking at them. Now what we want to do is look at each equation and see what we notice about the pairs. So if I look at graph 1, what you should notice is that your slopes are the exact same. And if we move on to graph 2, it's the same thing. The slopes are the same, and the same thing in graph 3. They're the same as well. So what we notice about parallel lines is that the slopes are the same. So the slopes are the same, or in other words, for slope, the m value, or your multiplier, etc. So all those different terms that we had. So they're the same value in our equation. In investigation 2, we're going to look at 3 more sets of lines, or pairs of lines. We can see them below. And what we're going to do is graph these and see what do we recognize about the lines. And when we do that, this is what our result should be. And what we notice, or what we should notice, is that, well, 1, these are not parallel lines because they're clearly crossing. But what we should notice is that they like to cross at a nice 90-degree angle. And we talked about it a little bit earlier. Because they intersect at a 90-degree angle, what do we notice? They are perpendicular. So we notice that these lines are perpendicular. We can see it from the graph. Now, if we're looking at just the equations, what do we notice about each pair? Now, you may think back to the parallel lines and think about how the parallel lines had the same slope, so you're going to look at the slopes. Well, let's look at the slopes. What do we notice? 2 and negative 1 over 2. 2 over 3, negative 3 over 2. 3 over 4, negative 4 over 3. So what do we notice about these pairs of perpendicular lines? Well, looking at these lines, what we should notice is that they are opposite. Right? 2, negative 1 over 2. Right? Those are the opposite. Right? And in other words, an opposite you could think of flipped. They're flipped. Right? 2 as a fraction is 2 over 1. 1 over 2 is just flipped. So you could think of an opposite flipped. You might notice that they're different signs. One's positive, one's negative. all of which are right. So that's all the things that we should be noticing. So as a summary, what do we notice or what can we conclude about parallel lines? Well, parallel lines are lines that have the same slope. Oops. So if you look at an equation of a line and you're trying to find a line that's parallel to it, it should have the same slope, exact same number. What do we notice about perpendicular lines? Well, perpendicular lines are lines whose slopes are negative reciprocals. And negative reciprocals is just a fancy word which means that the slopes are flipped and signs are changed. In other words, if we had a slope that's a over b, the negative reciprocal is now negative b over a. So we're flipping the fraction and we're changing the sign. So what you should get out of this note is just the understanding of what parallel lines are and how do they relate to each other in terms of the equation of a line. And again, what perpendicular lines are and how do they relate in terms of their equation of a line. And it's all done by looking at the slopes.